Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is an unusual voice. You're probably picking up on the one we had last week. Again, fun to have my daughter on for one time before she headed off to college. Both of them got off okay. Another Sunday perspective, weekend perspective, I guess, as it will be. This week I want to talk about something that, kind of getting back to the way we originally started doing weekend perspectives was, thinking about some trends that we've been kind of keeping an eye on. And then every once in a while, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens at the same time, sometimes coincidentally, sometimes on purpose. And I want to dive into kind of a bunch of things that we saw this past week. Some of them are going to seem like a big deal. Some are going to seem very minor. But it does feel like a very, very interesting time to be a software developer right now. And what I mean by that, and I guess sort of the premise of today's show is for the last decade or so, software developers are the new Kingmakers, to paraphrase a Stephen O'Grady Red Monk line and sort of well-known book. For the last decade, everything was built around the idea that software developers, their ability to build, their ability to create, to reshape industries was the direction we were going, was the trend in technology. And so we went from software is changing the economy, software is changing marketplaces, software is driving valuations of companies. And all that seemed very logical to us because we were seeing, things like, how transportation was being changed by technology and how money, how financial markets are being changed and how, communications and media and all sorts of industries are being changed by software. The ability to sort of combine new ways of using software with the internet, with new behaviors, new devices, all those sorts of things. And it feels a little bit now, and this is sort of the premise of what I want to talk about today, is, we talked about software changing the economy, changing markets. And now it feels like with the advent of AI for various reasons, good, bad, undefined at this point, we're unsure of yet. It does feel like we're now talking about the economics of software developers. And I think it's sort of an interesting thing to dig into because really for the last decade or so, we've essentially said you should, and this is the wrong way to think of it, but you should sort of hoard software developers as much as you can, because the more software developers you have working on things in an efficient way, in a smart way, you can significantly change your business. You can change the economics of your business. You can change the economics of how you partner with people, how you, what the cost of goods are, all sorts of really interesting things. And now with the advent of AI and copilots and some ramifications of, those types of things, we're now all of a sudden kind of having this very in-depth, I don't know if we're in the early innings or if we're, kind of really in the middle of it, but discussions about the economics of software developers. And I want to kind of dig into that after the break. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely, and another weekend perspective. Excited to be all with you all this weekend. I want to dig into, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I want to dig into what feels like, and again, sometimes these things are totally serendipitous and they just sort of all happen at the same time, but saw a number of articles this week, a number of sort of random data points, trying to put a few things together here, in which we're kind of shifting from people looking at software as being a really valuable commodity and looking at the economics of software impacting businesses to now looking at the economics and the cost and the efficiency of the people actually building software. And I want to frame that not in the sort of most common way that we used to, which was, well, we don't really know how to measure the value of software, so we'll measure everything in lines of code. And if people are developing X number of lines of code, then that's valuable, right? And there are lots and lots of metrics within the software development space. That's not necessarily the only one, but that's sort of the one that comes up all the time when we think about maybe the incorrect way to measure software development or to measure the efficiency of developers, right? I mean, you can look at number of features and frequency of releases and how many features you released in a given, time cycle. Did you meet, did you meet your, your cycles for each iteration if you're doing agile development? Are you getting more efficiency if you're doing pair programming. I mean, there's all sorts of metrics that developers use to sort of measure themselves, but the business didn't necessarily look at it in, really sort of, I don't know, big picture terms, right? They always thought of them as like, well, okay, those are technical things. They sort of fit in the IT budget. And then we spent the last decade or so, from, software is eating the world to developers in the Kingmakers to, sort of all of the proclamations that software was something that every business needed to be. They needed to all be a software company that also happened to do banking, a software company that also happened to build automobiles, software company that also happened to do healthcare, or, like we mentioned on a few shows ago, a software company that also happens to build fences, right? Whatever that means. And all that made a lot of logical sense. It made, it was very easy and tangible for us to, look at the experiences we were having with various types of companies. And again, a lot of these were dominated by sort of digital first companies, companies who, were sort of cloud first, online first. But, all you had to do was look at, other industries, look at automotives, which is a very hard goods, durable type of thing, right? I mean, you're talking about physical automobiles, right? Automobiles moved from everything was about horsepower and styling of the outside of the vehicle and, 0 to 60, how fast the car could go, to, it became and is evolving to become, some cases they're fully EV and some cases they're still hybrid and so forth. But so much more of the discussion as we talk about vehicles is about the experience within the vehicle, right? In-car entertainment and the battery systems and all those sort of things, right? Things that are driven by software, right? And we can expand this out to all sorts of different industries, whether it's, how people are trying to find new sources of energy, how we're looking at, doing healthcare and hopefully being able to deliver better care to patients and all these sorts of things that have a non-digital aspect to them, but software is changing so much of it. And, as an industry, we've looked at that and we've been, if you're in the software industry, if you're in the technology industry, you were like, this is great because not only did we change the industry 20 years ago when we sort of unlocked the internet and unlocked connectivity between everything, as CEO John Chambers of Cisco used to famously say, the internet's going to change how we live, how we work, live, and play, or something along those lines. Essentially he was saying like the internet's going to change every aspect of everything, and a lot of that proved out to be true. Again, there were some companies that were fast movers and others that were laggards and all those sort of things. But I think we generally sort of celebrated the idea that this thing in software and how software was built and the ability to iterate with it quickly and all those sort of things was was a tremendous boon for the technology industry, because it brought it from being a sort of a weird set of nerds that just did back office things that were just about the efficiency of workers or counting or whatever it was to really a kind of front and center. This was the experience that you were going to have in working with company X, right? So, we all sort of celebrated that. We all, I think there was, a lot of interest and pride and all sorts of things in, hey, technology is now really at the forefront. It's something that every business leader should be very well aware of. And we saw very many technology leaders eventually evolve into business leader roles and all those sort of things. All that aside, we also didn't really, in the same way that we do in other areas that we have very, very great accountability for how exactly something works. So for example, if you were to work in manufacturing, exactly what it cost for every minute, every second of trying to produce something, what every cycle of every machine being used costs, and you really fine tune how well you do something, because essentially you're doing something that is very repetitive, right? You're doing something that, you want to be repetitive. You're trying to create high quality, so you're trying to reduce variation within the thing, and also over time you want to reduce the cost of building that, so that as economies of scale happen, you're able to drive greater profitability of whatever it is, right? Once you've sort of perfected the building of that thing, you want to try and build it as efficiently as you can. And that's been happening in lots of different industries. Like we've seen this in manufacturing, we've seen it in finance with what the cost of a trade is and how people, view markets and the spread between different things within financial markets and so forth. So we've seen it, in a number of industries, but we've never really seen it in software. And I say that, and I'm sure there are people who, have lived in the software development space forever, and they're like, man, you have no idea how much the management, like looks over our shoulder, keeps track of things. And I can very much appreciate that, having lived in, in the side of the world in which we built products and have been product manager and have been, sort of downstream of products being built. I mean, you're always sort of dependent upon schedules. When is that next release coming out? When does that feature come out? Oh, are we getting it? Is it really going to come out on the 30th of the month, or is it going to, is it going to come out on the 1st of the month? Is it going to come out on the 30th of the month? Is it going to come out the last day of the quarter? So I can very much appreciate that. And I appreciate the pressure that people that build software are constantly under, because everybody expects that it's very easy to do. They always expect that the quality of whatever you produce is going to be great. And there's never any expectation that it might be slightly slower, slightly buggy, whatever the downsides of new technology could potentially be. But the reason I want to kind of dive into today is it does feel like, and again, this is a bunch of sort of random data points, but I want to try and connect the dots a little bit. If you've been listening to any of the large companies that are in the AI space, so Microsoft in particular, let's just take them for example. At the last Microsoft earnings, you had Satya Nadella talking about, the revenues that they were generating from OpenAI, and how a lot of it was being driven by sort of co-pilots or code assistants for software developers. And, he sort of threw out a thing that said, hey, the amount of money we make now with Copilot, GitHub Copilot or Azure Copilot, whatever they're calling it these days, is now higher than all of GitHub when we first acquired them. And, that seemed like things that he was trying to make a big deal of. I mean, the reality is I don't think GitHub was making that much money at the time, so it's irrelevant, but whatever. But he specifically called out that specific thing because of all the things in AI, especially the generative AI space, being able to allow software developers to augment what they do with some sort of AI copilot, whether it's, helping you write code faster, maybe it's writing tests for you, maybe it's reviewing code, maybe it's helping you do design, whatever it might be. It is one of the most tangible things in the generative AI space that anybody can point to, because the demos are very straightforward. These models have all been trained on huge amounts of code bases, as well as the programming, language, essentially the tutorials, the books about how these languages are supposed to work. And because it is a kind of sort of a defined thing in many cases, its ability to do something valuable is very tangible, right? People can point at it and they can go, oh yes, we have software developers. They have this thing that augments what they do. I can demonstrate it for you. And the feedback from software developers, for the most part, has been, this is pretty good. This is helpful, right? And we've seen numbers, it makes you 25% more effective, 50% more effective, sometimes more effective. Again, it always depends on the use case. But what's interesting about it is it's also the thing that, because it is proven to be effective, and because it has a very specific tangible use case, it's very easy for companies that are selling this stuff to go, oh, I can put a price on it, right? I can charge you for that. And again, whether or not we figured out exactly how much is the right price for that, or how effective developers should be, that's still in flux. And that's sort of not the biggest issue at this point. The thing is, we found a use case, right? We have a minimum viable product, if you will, for Gen AI, and that is code assistance. And so that's fantastic. That's great. I suspect in order for Gen AI to be as world changing as many people are expecting it, or the stock market has priced in, or companies are beginning to bet their future on, it's going to have to do much, much more than just assist developers. But it's a very, very good task, right? It's again, one of the things you want to be able to do is point to a very distinct use case and go, can we solve that? Can we make it better? So let's check that box. Now, what's interesting about that is it gets into really an interesting discussion. And again, this is something that doesn't have an answer of what's our expectation for these software copilots, right? And I keep saying copilot. I don't always intend that to just be sort of GitHub, but copilot is a fantastic name and it's being adopted all over the place. So, code assistants, right? What do we expect from them? Do we expect them to augment software developers. So what we mean by that is, you should think of it as like for every software developer, you have a extra software developer that just happens to be, an assistant, right? So everybody gets an assistant, and maybe that person is essentially their pair programmer. Maybe that assistant is their pair programmer. That assistant is maybe actively looking for, flaws in the code, bugs, errors, whatever. Maybe it's suggesting, ways to augment the software. Maybe it's suggesting entire blocks of software, whatever it might be. Maybe it's writing tests. Maybe it's writing, the tests in order to validate the software, right? That's one sort of assumption, right? It is, you are essentially purchasing or using an assistant for every software developer, and the assumption is the cost of that is obviously not a one-for-one with the cost of the software developer, but hopefully the cost of it is less than the augmentation that you get from doing. So fantastic use case. The second question is, do we expect it to be a replacement, right, for the software developer? So, will we be able to start having non-software developers, if you will, right? So think of it as, kind of in the same way that the whole no-code industry talks about, well, you don't have to be, citizen developers, right? Maybe you could be a business analyst. Maybe you could be a marketer. Maybe you could be a whatever you are. You're just a manager of a team. Low-code has sort of said, hey, if you have things that you need to build some software for, but it's things that essentially you could, draw out on a whiteboard and you could build some building blocks. It's just process stuff. You could do a lot of things with low code, right? And so in that case, you're sort of, are you replacing a software developer, or are you augmenting a knowledge worker, right? So we're now kind of getting into that gray area of like, is this thing targeted at software developers, or are we starting to get into it's targeting non-software developers to give them the superpower of being a software developer, right? Do we eventually get to a point where we come up with some interesting language, right? I mean, obviously, we've seen these examples from OpenAI and others where somebody just draws something on the back of a napkin and kind of points it at OpenAI and it goes, "Oh, you would like to build a better mousetrap? Cool, let me write all that software for you." And then we go, "Oh, that's really cool." Right now, we ignore the fact that it doesn't really exactly tell me how I'm going to test that, how I'm going to deploy it, how I'm going to do HA around it, all those sort of things. But the assumption in those types of demos is like, well, those things will just get done. They'll just get taken care of. And in those cases, you've really sort of said, well, as long as somebody can think up the idea, sort of the mythical people are sitting around at a bar on the back of a napkin, but they have a great idea. In that case, you're sort of replacing developers, right? So now we've gotten a little more into the gray areas or in the spectrum. We've gone from like augmenting developers to augmenting non-developers to sort of replacing developers. And there's probably other things within that spectrum to consider. And so the question becomes, if you are looking at these types of tools, what's your expectation? What are you assuming? What are you expecting? How will you measure the success of it? And the reason I went through all that sort of long-winded stuff, and if you're still listening, fantastic, was there was a couple of interesting articles this week, right? The first one was a LinkedIn post from Andy Jassy, who's now the CEO of Amazon, formerly the CEO of AWS. And he basically highlighted the internal impact, again, whether it's 100% true or not, who knows. But he essentially wrote a long LinkedIn post talking about the impact of using these co-pilots to essentially help the internal Amazon teams with their legacy code bases to try and modernize them, or at least bring them up to a newer version, right? And again, didn't go into the details of like, hey, did I take some legacy code base and like modernize it and so forth, or am I really just sort of moving from Java X to Java Y, right? But the reason I highlight that is a example at a very, very high level. Now, granted, Amazon's a technology company, but at a very, very high level in which they are measuring the efficiency of this augmentation system, right? In their case, they're talking about Amazon Q, but essentially it is a developer assistant augmentation system, right? It's helping the current developers that are there that have to maintain these systems, and it's augmenting them. And that's fantastic, right? It was great to see some numbers. Again, whether those numbers apply to your business or not doesn't really matter, right? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But it was interesting to sort of highlight that. Now, the reason I highlight that, and the reason I even bothering with this thing, because, for a company to come out and say, hey, we're eating our own dog food. Okay, cool. Every technology vendor, every cloud provider does the same thing. Hey, we all use our own stuff. Okay, great. What was interesting, though, was there was another article that was more sort of and again, you probably are going to need to get behind a paywall to get access to this. I've read some of it. I didn't read all of it. The new AWS CEO, Matt Garman, made some statements to his developers saying, soon the developers might stop coding and the, sort of coding assistants are going to start taking over. And again, those are things that oftentimes get taken out of context. But it was interesting, just even within the same week, and you never know if these things actually happen within the same time frame. But you've got two parts of the company that are saying, we're augmenting the software teams, and another one saying we might be looking to deprecate some of the software teams or replace the software teams, or maybe we do the sort of famous thing that everybody in technology does, where they say, well, we're going to take you out of low value work and move you into high value work. Right? Maybe that's what they mean. But I highlight this because, again, it's even within the same company, it showcases that you can have two very different perspectives on what do we expect these things to do, right? What's the future of software development going to be if we're moving from software is changing the economics of our business to what's the economics of those software developers? Because again, like I mentioned early on, for a while there, it was, hire as many of them as we possibly can because we will find work for them to do. And if put in the right direction, pointed in the right direction, doing the right things, we are going to see outsized returns from using software to change our business. Right. Now, next thing I sort of saw that was interesting was, and this was a kind of a blog post, a Substack sort of thing. So again, take it with a grain of salt, was somebody working for a SaaS company. And essentially they were saying, hey, look, we provide this SaaS service. The service doesn't really matter, but they're saying I provide a SaaS service. There are thousands of companies like this that provide a SaaS service, and people integrate with their SaaS service to do whatever they do. And so he said, a lot of my life is we publish an API that describes the service that we provide in lots of details. We have documentation about it. And as we're onboarding new customers, oftentimes we get requests from people that go, hey, something's not working. Here's the block of code that I use to talk to your API. Can you give me some sense of what's going on? And he says, we do it, for a while, it was very common to do a certain amount of small troubleshooting, and in some cases, helping them rewrite their code in order to be able to talk to their API, because if they could get them to talk to the API and they understood what the API did, then they potentially had a customer. And obviously, that's valuable to a business, or any business. And the whole point of the article was, though, that this person was saying, I'm starting to reach a breaking point in which, or a boiling point, or just a frustration point, because so much of the code that I'm now seeing, it's very clear to me that it is Gen AI generated code, essentially a non-software developer saying, hey, I need to work with this service, or I'd like to work with this service, but I don't really know how to write software. And so I'm going to go ask ChatGPT or whatever to generate me the code that's needed to talk to this API. And he said, unfortunately, for whatever reason, that code quality isn't great, right? And you can take a look at the article. But it did sort of highlight an interesting thing in my mind of, how frequently are we going to see this, right? So remember I talked about, are we augmenting software developers, sort of what Andy Jassy talked about? Are we augmenting non-software developers, but we're still augmenting them with a thing that writes code? That sort of feels like a thing in the middle, right? And we always said for a long time, like, hey, you should learn to write code, right? Don't be a coal miner anymore. Learn to write code. And, for a lot of people, if you don't come from a computer science background, and, the idea of like learning a language is a little scary, which I can relate to. I've tried a number of times to sort of start to figure out this stuff without, kind of working directly with somebody. It can be intimidating. And so the idea that you could just sort of ask a co-pilot type of service to say, hey, I have an idea, do this stuff, make it do this stuff. Here, I'm going to explain it to you as a human being would do, is really appealing, because there are plenty of times when I'm like, boy, I wish I could make some software do this thing, because if I could connect A to B to C, there's an interesting business application for that, or whatever it might be. And so I think we're going to start seeing more and more of that. And while that's a great thing on one hand, it does sort of lend itself to, how much toil are we going to put on, what I will call real software developers, real DevOps teams, real SRE teams, people that, essentially are, having to interact with their customers, and their customers aren't really qualified to work with them. And that's a weird situation to be in, right? Like if you're a fast food restaurant, like you don't ever think like, oh, these people walking up to get food aren't qualified to do that. But to a certain extent with technology, there is some expectation that you are marginally qualified. And again, this might sort of highlight another sort of downstream aspect of, well, if you're seeing that more and more and it's frustrating you, but you think those people could also be your customers, you're probably going to have to do more to make it simple enough such that they are no longer non-qualified, right? And you're going to have to figure out what those gaps are. And so I thought they were sort of three interesting data points on this spectrum of what's it going to be, what's it going to look like in a few years, especially as more and more companies, vendor side companies are going, hey, the justification for AI, the simplest one that everybody can understand is software development copilots or, code assistants. And so they're going to be pushing those, and they're going to be pushing numbers like Andy Jassy pushed, and they're going to say, your life's going to be better, right? We're not doing changing the world software. We're doing make your life better, save you money, make you more efficient, all those sort of things. And I'll be very curious to sort of watch the downstream of this, because we've seen these types of things before, right? They are essentially technology presented as a silver bullet. And what happens is there are some people that are rational about it and others that are irrational. And the downstream effect of that is they jump in with both feet. They don't really understand the situation. They may decide, hey, we're going to, lay off a bunch of people that have a bunch of skills that we, use today all the time, but they're not necessarily going to be the most efficient in the new world. And so therefore we want to, let them go and then go find these new skills that are efficient for the new world. Well, those skills don't totally yet exist, right? So anyways, I think it's going to be really interesting to sort of watch the downstream implications of what do people think these things do that are going to help us enhance software developers. Are they looking to augment the developer? Are they looking to augment the non-developer? Are they looking to replace the developer? Are they looking to, do other things on that spectrum, right? Like what happens in the split between junior coders and, junior developers and senior developers, right? We've already seen some changes happen in that space where, companies are hiring, say, less junior developers, or their expectations, they're able to onboard them immediately. There's no learning curve. There's no sort of training and mentoring programs. What happens to systems integrators that are being asked to maintain these things and that run businesses? Are they going to really embrace these things? Are you going to see customers asking them to cut their fees by 50% once they figure out that they're augmenting them? All those sort of things. So I think there's a lot of really interesting sort of downstream, what's going to happen to the role of software developer, and how much do these new AI assistants shape that versus, their ability to, kind of measure the work that they do themselves, or the work as a whole, or whatever. So I think it'd be really interesting over the next few years to sort of see, does the AI industry sort of shift to this because it is a very tangible money-making use case, right? Does it push it higher to the forefront? Does it become important at businesses, right? Like how many businesses have lots and lots of developers, but that could be a lot of them. And then, how do we measure that? What's it tangibly looking at, and so forth. So anyways, couple of data points kind of threw me in this direction. It got me thinking about it, but it also got me thinking about, kind of how this potentially, again, shifts my sort of main thesis for today, that we may potentially stop talking about software in terms of it impacting the business from an economic perspective. And we talk about software in terms of measuring developers less, from an economic perspective, and more from a cost of goods inputted, cost of raw material, which I don't think any developer really wants to go down that path. But I think it's something to sort of be wary of. And again, I think there's probably going to be some good ways to do this, some bad ways to do this. We'll see some horror stories. We will see some, we'll see some case studies that are, fantastic and new lighthouses for what this means. But I think it's something that's definitely kind of worth keeping an eye on, especially as your business might be looking to implement some of these things. Again, whether it comes from the top down or ground up and groundswell to go do it. So anyways, something to keep an eye on. Would love to hear your feedback as to how your business is, if they're looking at these, if you're using these tools beyond just sort of your own personal use. How is your business starting to how to perceive what the usage is, what the economics are, what they expect the economics to be, and what do you think the next steps of that might be. So anyways, with that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks you all for listening. Again, I am going to be traveling like crazy over the next 6, 7, 8 weeks. I think I'm gone every single weekend for the next 6, 7, 8 weeks. I will do my best to keep getting out the weekend perspectives. The Wednesday shows, Aaron's done a really good job of making sure we're booked out for quite a bit of those. So I will do the best I can on the weekend perspectives. There may be a week or two again where I'm traveling a ton. My schedule just went from like manageable to insane over the last couple of weeks. So anyways, we might be doing some of these from different locations around the world. But anyways, thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend about the show. Thanks for helping us grow the show. If you ever have any questions, show@thecloudcast.net. Hopefully that is the best place to ping us about things, questions you want to be on the show, all that sort of stuff. So with that, I'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.